Welcome back to another Pen Talk. Thanks for tuning in. We see before us a vintage pen that's in its final restoration stages, and I wanted to show the pen before I fully assemble it so you can get an idea of the different pieces. So I put a bladder on here, and this was a challenge to get this thing together. There's my shellac at the bottom, so I put the sack on with a little bit of wood glue underneath of it. I let it dry for a day, and then I shellac the very bottom here where it connects to the section, so that seals it and also stabilizes the sack, which is a little soft. One of the reasons why this pen is now under restoration is when I pulled it out of my collection and took a look at the nib, I go, wow, this nib has a lot of potential. The feed's a little short relative to the nib, but you know, I did a good flush on this. I'm not going to take this apart and reseat it because I like to see how it writes as it was put away many years ago. The cap is just a classic Chase hard rubber, and it has this third-party clip on it, which is fairly typical of pens of this era. I'd say this is about 1915 to no more than 1920. There could have been a clip here that broke in my research on this pen company, Byers and Hayes. It looks like the clips they put in there were not very you know, secure, and there's a tendency for them to come out. But the black rubber is in excellent condition. There's a little bit of oxidation on it, but the chasing pattern is still very easy to see. Then if we look at the barrel, we can catch the imprint. It's always good to put it in the right orientation. So there it is, Byers and Hayes Company, New York. That's it. And it's the same Chase pattern. It's in the cap, so I know they're part of it. And the other interesting logo is there appears to be some type of logo embossed in the lever here. It's kind of off center, but apparently that's a stylized B&H, which I've seen on the web on some other examples of this pen. You know, it's a standard lever fill with the rod that it rotates on is through the hard rubber. It comes up, it comes down. I don't know whether we're going to be able to see inside, but this is not a typical lever fill. I mean, I've read that they did a lot of strange things with lever fill. They had to stay away from the patents of Schaefer and Waterman. And the gentleman, one of the gentlemen who founded this company, used to work for A.A. Waterman, and that's a discussion in another video. So I'm going to be putting this pen together, basically just talking the sack, and I got to be gently inserting it because I had to really do a lot to clean out some old bladder inside of here, because originally this sack wouldn't even fit in there. And this is a number 16. I don't want to go any smaller than that. So I just want to give you this preview of how it looks before I finally assemble it. So the early 1900s until the 1930s was pretty much the golden age of American fountain pen manufacturers. So I assembled a few pens from that era. Here is the Byers and Hayes. Here's a Waterman's 55. Here's that Conklin Crescent filler. Here's a 52. And here's a Parker Jackknife. As you can see, various conditions here. This one had no chasing on it. This one, the chasing has worn away quite a bit. And we can compare the 52, as I mentioned to you before, to the Byers and Hayes. It's a little bit shorter, but it's about the same circumference and a similar type of cap. And, you know, no cap bands. You know, it varies from style to style, from pen to pen. If you look at some of the catalogs from this era, these people made a ton of variety of pens. And Byers and Hayes being located in New York, they were probably in that time frame of 1900 to 1930, probably 100 or more pen manufacturers located in New York City. I'm certain a lot of them could have been job shoppers. They all made parts for each other. They all kind of competed for a market, which at that time was 1 million pens plus a year. And look at this ad from Byers and Hayes. You'll see that these pens were not inexpensive, considering at the time frame that was a lot of money for anybody. But people who wanted to write and needed a writing instrument and didn't want to use a pencil, this was the only option that they had. These pens become very large, all over 6 inches in overall length. So that's one of the interesting parts of the vintage. You can tell which ones I've inked up because you do get a little ink creep in these pens. Some of these pens have been setting for a while, so you know that's not unexpected with temperature changes and everything else. Obviously, the Waterman 55 has a substantially larger nib than the other pens, but the other pens are probably more typical of the pens of the year. And you will see the amount of flex on the Byers and Hayes, and even though it's the smallest nib in this group, it is not small in performance. And the amount of ink that it lays down and the amount of spread that it gives is substantial. Sections are very similar. None of them are very big. Even the number 5 doesn't have a very large section. All of them have a pretty good flare out at the end where the nib is, and I think that was a style and also what users of the pens expected. Interesting to find out what kind of ink to put into a pen. So I think this sepia ink from Roher and Klinger would be a nice one. I have this in a few other pens, and I think as far as sepia goes, it has a nice color to it, and it probably will work well in what I think is going to be a real wet noodle writer. So we'll just do a filling, and this is the first time I've done this, so live and on camera. So we insert this into, so the ink is just above the nib in the middle of the section. Nice bubbles. So I'm going to do this 3 times. And I mentioned to you before, I do this on all my fillings of pens. I want a nice clean flush, let the ink flush through the feed, make certain everything gets saturated. On the final one, we'll wait about 10 seconds, to give that sac the final time to expand. We'll bring it out, we'll dab it off, and we'll put nib to paper. So I would say the size of this pen is typical of pens of this era. It's like a Waterman 52 size. About 1 3/4 turns to remove the cap. It's long enough to fit well in the hand, any hand without posting. It can be posted, but not very deeply, so that makes for a huge, large pen posted. So, you can be done. It's very light. It doesn't change the balance. So let's take a look at nib on paper. This is a classic soft nib of the period. I've done a little bit of smoothing. I also adjusted the nib a little bit further down, a little bit further up, so the feed and the nib, the distance is not greater. I may pop that feed out, which I need to take the pen apart, and I should have done that probably before I put the bladder on, but like I say, I like to put pens to paper as received first. So that's your cross strokes. And here are your downstrokes, and as you can see, it doesn't take much to really spread that to, a triple or quadruple broad. And I like this ink color. I think it works good. Part of the problem was the upstrokes were very sharp and they'd catched on the paper, so I did a little bit of smoothing with my emery board. And now it's smooth in all directions. I mean, this lays down an incredible amount of ink, very typical of the watermans of the day. Takes a while to dry. And as you can see, this ink does a nice kind of subtle bit of shading, which I like. And as I say, for a sepia color, from what I would like, I like it. You know, particularly how it looks here in this patch. I don't particularly like some of the shade as you spread the ink out, but it's kind of a nice brown there with some kind of interesting overtones. Look at how this nib looks close up. With no pressure, it lays down a nice solid line. This is also one of those pens that write with no pressure. But just a slight bit of pressure, you can see how those tines just open right up. It's hard to explain. I mean, this is, to me, a very good example of the types of nibs that were popular in the early 1900s. You know, obviously become kind of a grail nib today for people. I don't think the Roher and Klinger ink is that unique that it actually, you know, holds that cohesion when those tines really spread, but it does work well, I have to admit. I could do this. You can see you can railroad it, but that does take a lot. And the feed recovers quickly. I've seen people do this. I don't know how they do it. I guess that's how it works. So hopefully you've enjoyed this little view of a pen that flexes. Wonderful. Look at the ink after it's dried for about a half an hour. I just wanted to show you the shading that this ink does, and hopefully a little bit of appreciation of this interesting sepia color. A little bit of a more of a close-up. You can see how when the tines spread, you get a little bit more saturation of ink on the edge of the downstrokes, and a little bit of look of how the ink looks on the paper. Very reminiscent, I think, of what I expect out of a sepia ink and also out of a vintage pen. So I just wanted to take a quick jaunt and show you this pen I've been taking to the Apple Pen Meet this week. So Wet Noodle seems to be a popular pen, so I'm certain they may not have seen this pen, and it's from New York City, so that should be interesting. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed another look at a vintage pen, which might be unique to many of my viewers. I enjoy bringing that to them. Again, this section is kind of small, but that's typical of pens of this era. As I mentioned to you before, people wrote with quills and pencils, and this is probably a little bit thicker than that. And then this nice little upturn here keeps your fingers away from the nib. So may you have many great writing experiences. Explore the world of pens and inks, and add them to your enjoyment of life. Bye.